Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. My name is Pete Welch, and I'm the moderator for this morning's program. This morning, we'd like to visit about a topic that's one that's been discussed recently, and that is that of college athletics and the controversy that's come up with players considering themselves wanting to become unionized or receiving some sort of compensation over and above what they do now in some form of scholarship. With us this morning first is Mr. John Chandler, who's the athletic director at Coe College. Good morning, John.
Good morning.
Next with us this morning is Nate Willems, who's an attorney with Rush and Nicholson here in Cedar Rapids.
Pleasure to be here.
And finally, we have J.R. Ogden, who's the sports editor with the Cedar Rapids Gazette, somebody whose columns we've read and have enjoyed over our morning coffee.
Yeah,
J.R.?
Thank you.
Okay. To borrow a phrase from an advertising line by Clara Peller, what's the beef about this topic? J.R., start us off.
I think it comes down to the pay for play. I think, I think they're looking for some compensation. I mean, football players. This is all football that they've been talking about so far. And the Division I level, and even down the Division III level, sometimes they spend so much of their time either in training camp or training or doing things on their own that they feel they need some compensation for that. They're worried about concussions, among other injuries and things like that. And I think the whole thing came down to the protection of the players. Are they protected? Does the NCAA protect them? A lot of people say the NCAA will not protect them. The NCAA is more about the institution, not about the individual players, and that's another debate, I guess, that people are having. But I think it comes down to simply that they're looking for some pay. I mean, what was it, the old story about the Fab Four at Michigan? They were walking around campus and couldn't afford a Big Mac, yet they were seeing every one of their jerseys hanging up in a store selling for $15 or something like that, and they were getting none of that. And I think that's kind of part of the whole thing, how the whole thing got started.
Now, John, you're at Coe College, and one of the things that we like to do with this show is describe a little bit of the playing field, if you will. So can you help some of our viewers this morning to like the differences between an Iowa State, and then you and Coe, and what those differences are, so that we can inform our public this morning?
Definitely. Coe College is a private liberal arts school, and we have approximately 1,310 students. The difference between Coe College and the schools we're talking about, Iowa State, University of Iowa, Northern Iowa, is that we do not offer athletic grants and aid, athletic scholarships. We do offer scholarships for academics, music, art, but we do not offer athletic scholarships. And so our student athletes are paying their way through college.
And so like where Iowa has had a lot of successful football players move on to the NFL and that, you've really, had one in form of Kerry Bender?
We've actually had two. We've had Kerry Bender, and currently Fred Jackson plays for the Buffalo Bills. And that's out of many years of student athletes, and so it's one of those things that there are some differences, but like JR touched on, there's also similarities. They spend a lot of time practicing, going over film, weight training, all those types of things, just like the Division I athletes. The difference is they don't receive that athletic grant and aid.
Now, the sports that really are the money producers in college, aren't there really relatively few, between football and perhaps basketball being the two primary ones?
Well, football pretty much pays the bills for everything at the Division I level. I don't know how that breaks down at Division III level, but I know Division I level football pretty much pays for everything. Basketball is a moneymaker. But basketball also spends a lot of money on travel and things like that. They've got more games, they've got more competitions, different things like that. At a school like University of Iowa, wrestling actually makes a little bit of money, which is really rare for a sport like that. And I'm sure other schools have niche sports like that that are probably low cost, but they do generate some income through attendance and things like that. But football is really the big beast, and has been kind of set aside a lot of times by a lot of people for a lot of rules, gender equity, a lot of things. People say, well, let's just push football aside. It's different than the sports because it does carry so much weight and does pay the bills at a lot of colleges.
Okay, and a lot of that football revenue goes to the NCAA.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the relationship is, but yeah, it does, especially when it comes to the bowl games and the NCAA tournament, basketball tournaments going on right now. Things like that make a lot of money for the NCAA, and the NCAA is I don't know what, $1 billion industry. I know they're making a lot of money. They're not hurting. Let's put it that way.
And one thing put in perspective is the NCAA, their largest revenue source is the March Madness tournament, which is going on right now. Their contract with CBS is unbelievable, and it actually benefits Division III because the budget for NCAA Division III, we get, I think it's about 4% of that television contract, which helps take care of the expenses that we have for Division III. And I'll be honest with you, our membership dues, I think last year for the NCAA for our school was $900.
Wow.
And so schools don't pay a lot of money to be a member of the NCAA, but they get a lot back from those things. So that's something that some people didn't know, that, as far as like football, the BCS is completely different than the NCAA.
Right.
And so the NCAA doesn't get any money from the BCS bowl games. That's a complete different entity. But they do get from one, which is we would call the football championship subdivision, which is 1AA. Northern Iowa's in that, Division II and Division III. So NCAA does run those 3 football championships.
Nate, how do you suppose the public would feel about monopolies in other industries if the NCAA has a monopoly?
Well, yeah, there you go. And you've seen that in professional sports too. Professional baseball, professional football having to, over the years, face antitrust kind of litigation or get an exemption even from Congress. There were people, I know years ago, or people probably who still say that when free agency ruined Major League Baseball or that sort of
Wasn't that the
thing.
Curt Flood case
That
started it all?
That sounds right. But that was a case of Major League Baseball players saying, hey, I want to sell my labor for the highest price to the highest bidder, and typically that's the way our markets work. That's the way our kind of economy works, and Major League Baseball players were allowed to do so. I don't think that's exactly what's happening here with these Northwestern football players, but certainly I think that I'm sure it is about the pie, how the pie is divided up, and players some players probably feeling that they should get a little bit more compensation. But I think a lot of it is probably that players probably just don't want to be completely 100% at the mercy of that university and that football program. They want to be able to bargain, not just necessarily wages or hours, but some of the safety precautions or kind of the terms and conditions of employment. If you're willing to regard it as such, that what they do day in and day out, year round for their respective athletic programs.
Now, if we were having our listeners and viewers this morning a case in point, would one of those be what happened with the basketball player Utoff from Cedar Rapids when the Wisconsin coach says you can't go to Iowa initially? Is it kind of part of this, JR?
I think that's part of it. I think what Nate said was exactly right. They're saying they want more freedom and they want more say in, I guess, what's going on. And what's happening with them. It's one of those things that it's what's an education worth? I mean, what's an education worth at Northwestern?
$250,000.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a bit of money you're talking there, but they're also, like I said, they take a lot of their time up, and they take a lot of their, to the point where they don't have any money to go to take a date to a movie or something like that on some time. So I think they are. I think they're looking for a lot of the safety. That's at least what Kane Coulter, who was kind of the force behind the whole thing, came up and said, we want a say in what's going on here. We want to at least be heard, and they don't think the NCAA hears them. They said that, as a matter of fact, read something right before I came down, is that they're saying this is not against Northwestern. We love Northwestern. We just want to say in our futures and what's going to happen to us out there on the football field.
And I can certainly say that if you were a student at Northwestern, going to Northwestern on a scholarship, getting very little spending money, if you wanted to go out on a date and eat in Chicago, it's going to be expensive.
Yeah.
And so they're looking to possibly share the wealth a little bit.
Well, see, they can't have jobs. Well, I mean, they
can have jobs in the summer.
It's hard for them to make that kind of money. And then, of course, that's when you have the unscrupulous people come in and offer them to pay for the dinner. And if they do that, they're breaking an NCAA rule. And I think that's probably some of the negotiation they want to have in there.
Okay, and John, isn't one of the other issues about how sufficient those scholarships amounts are based upon the cost of living, and they haven't really moved in a long time?
Well, and basically what happens is they'll get an athletic grant and aid, so their tuition will be paid for, their fees, their books, and then they receive a stipend each month, which will cover their housing and their meals. And it depends when they're in season. Typically, they will have a training table, so they have their meals paid for. If they go on a road trip, their meals are all paid for. But then they'll have a certain amount of money that they will use for the monthly expenses of their room and their meals. I mean, I know some people who were very recently Division I athletes, and I've asked them, I said, do you think that was a sufficient amount of money? And they said, yeah, it was fine. And it's one of those, if you get together with 2 or 3 people, you get an apartment or a house, and I think, and they always thought, hey, it was a pretty good deal, what they went through. And then I think you have some that think, well, it's not. And it's a discussion. It's like anything. There's going to be people on both sides of.
I think that one of the surveys recently said that it was 47% for unionization, 47% against unionization for it. So it is a very split down the middle decision going on here. At the University of Iowa, which you just brought up there, just not that long ago, they had the controversy over a bunch of the players living in low-income housing because that's what they were doing. They were taking that monthly stipend and they were making their payments or rent or whatever it was, and whatever was left over was their money they could put in their pocket. And there was a lot of people who thought that was wrong too, that they shouldn't be able to do that.
Well, everybody has an opinion on everything that a student athlete does at a place like the University of Iowa.
I think that's part of it is because what you just said there, they're so much in the limelight. Everything they do. I mean, you go anywhere in this area in eastern Iowa here, and you're going to see a Hawkeye jersey worn by one of the star players, and they see that. Of course, it gives them good recognition and stuff. But they're saying, okay, why can't I get part of that? Why can't I be part of that scenario? You're using my number. You're using my image to do that. But if we want to use our image in advertising, for instance, in the newspaper or the TV, we're not allowed to do that.
No.
Do you think that the college athletics is being used as kind of a training ground for like NBA, NFL stars?
I mean,
Absolutely.
It is, but there's a very small percentage that actually make it. And I think they think, and most of them have those aspirations. I think many times some of them aren't very realistic about what their chances are going to be. I mean, JR, you've seen.
It's a very small percentage, but
it is, and that's I think what the coaches and the universities and colleges are trying to stress is, that may be an aspiration of yours, but you need to take advantage of this scholarship that you have and go to school and get your degree, because that's not a given. I mean, look at what's the life expectancy for a running back in the NFL? 3.5 years?
Like that,
That's right.
Okay, so what are you going to do after that 3.5 years?
So, JR, is that what the NCAA is trying to do when they have that ad that goes on TV that talks about all those other athletes?
Yeah, and most of you are going to go pro in something else.
Something else, and that's very true. I mean, and their stance on this whole thing is, these are not our employees. These athletes are not our employees. They're here voluntarily. They're not our employees. And they said the unionization of them kind of takes away from what college is all about, which is supposed to be an education.
Okay.
Just because a university or any employer says that these are not my employees doesn't necessarily make it so. I mean, there are legal tests as to really whether you fit in the definition of an employee or not. And it's going to be, this case is going to be litigated, and who knows how it's going to turn out.
Well, JR, you used a very interesting term there, and I'm going to focus on it. And it was, these kids are here voluntarily. Now, that argument was used with our volunteer service members who got activated and sent overseas to Iraq and Afghanistan, got injured in doing the bidding of the United States government, and came back injured. And certain people in the current administration said, well, let them go back on civilian insurance and pay for their rehab on the injuries. Well, what about these same athletes at the colleges that get injured? The schools cut them loose, and then the families stuck trying to pay for their child who had the best of all intentions, got injured, and now has medical bills, and the university cuts them loose.
And I think that's part of the root of the problem that I think a lot of them are saying is, I mean, and it depends, institutions handle it differently.
It's up to the institution.
An institution might say, look, geez, we're going to take care of you. We're going to make sure, you run. Another one might just say, I mean, the scholarships, I believe, even in football, are renewable every year.
They're 1 year.
And so they don't have to put you back on scholarship.
And they do have a certain allotment. Let's say there's a student athlete that has a career-ending injury. They have a certain allotment that they can use as a medical, and that won't count against their total. And so I've known that there's been student athletes who have been injured their first year, and they've been kept on scholarship throughout. And it depends on the institution if they want to do that, which I think would be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think.
And some don't. Some are ruthless.
Some just cut them loose and say, okay, you're on your own. Like you just said, they send them back out to society. Say, okay, let your parents' insurance take care of this.
So really, what we have here is, beware for the student that check out the background of the institution that you want to go to, and do this type of work with. And it's like picking a company that you go to work for a career. You want to pick a good one.
Your due diligence.
And do that.
But you can never know. I mean, the coaching changes all the time. Different athletic directors come and go. I mean, like JR mentioned, Kane Coulter at Northwestern, he said, was very clear that, hey, I've got no issue with my head coach, Pat Fitzgerald, or Northwestern University. I think that they do everything the right way, but, just kind of being entirely at their mercy, is something I'm not particularly comfortable with.
And aren't there some rules that they allow
20 hours a week?
Athletes that if there's a coaching change or something, and they've got a letter of commitment that they can reconsider?
If they've signed a letter of intent, they're allowed to switch if there's a coaching change, I'm
not sure what the rules are when they're already at the institution. If if you've been going there for 2 years and you have a new coach, I don't think I think then you're stuck. You have to stay. But in that
there's a lot of transfer
in that citing period where you sign your letter of intent, and if there's a coaching change in that, then you can get out of it without any penalty.
Yeah.
But anytime you want to leave school on scholarship and you want to go to a school like Jared Uthoff wanted to, you're going to lose it. But depending where you go, you might lose your scholarship, and the coach can ban you from going to certain schools, cannot release you to certain schools.
That certainly seems rather monopolistic. If they could do that.
It's rather interesting, and I've kind of been in the middle of that whole situation because I went to school in Wisconsin, so I was on, and I know some of the things, and everyone's heated about it. But
so we're an equal opportunity show. We're presenting a Badger outlook.
Yes. No, but we had, and that was an unfortunate situation, but I think it got blown up because it happens at every school. It has happened to us at Coe College, where we have had Division I schools will not give us permission to speak to a student athlete, and we're a Division III school.
So that you're saying a Division I program is afraid of you people at Coe talking
They have put the time and effort into recruiting a student athlete, and they may have certain schools that they don't want to. I know, they talked when that whole situation happened at Syracuse. That was a Big East. They had a rule that you couldn't transfer within the Big East.
Well, I mean, and it wasn't all that many years ago when Tom Brands moved over from Virginia Tech as Iowa wrestling coach.
He wanted
to bring 3 wrestlers with him who were from Lynn County and Iowa City, and the school would not release them. So they had to come and go to school there, sit out a year, and pay for their own school and that was out of, that was out of pure animosity toward him leaving.
That was just bitterness.
That was bitterness, exactly.
And sometimes what coaches will do sometimes, especially at that level, is they'll look at who they have on their schedule, and if they're going to play somebody in a year or two, they don't want that student athlete transferring to the other school.
Right.
Boy, it seems like you're treating athletes like property or chattel to be treated.
But what we say on the front end, even when we recruit student athletes, is do your due diligence, look at the school. You should be going to school for the school, okay? Because you don't know, like you said, a coach could be gone tomorrow. And then you can't say, well, I came because of the coach. In my opinion, that's the wrong reason to go to that school. Go for the school and what it's about. And the athletics is part of your experience. That should be part of it. But you also have to do due diligence with, investigating, examining the school.
So if we did the reverse of what you just said, go to the school for the school, what if you're going for the sole purpose of your dream of getting into the professional leagues? Do you forget about the school and go with the program?
That happens.
Or that's a risk you take?
That's a risk. I think that's a risk you take if you decide you want to go to Kentucky because you think you're going to play in the NBA
Right.
you're going to play
You think
1 year.
you're going to play 1 year as a freshman and go pro?
And if you think that's maybe a chance that you'll take.
And there's players every year, especially in basketball, that do that. And the next thing you know, they're playing in the NBA D League,
Or they're in Europe,
or Europe,
yeah.
and you don't,
And
and you don't ever hear
that's
of
a
them
risk. That's a risk that they take, I think. And you know what? And I think that's something that they have to look at. That's up to that individual. How they want to do that.
Okay. Now, Nate, I have a question for you about Title IX and how it might affect some of these. And hopefully, if I said Title IX and we explain to our viewers what's going on, and I'm not picking on, say, like the Iowa women's crew team, but after tomorrow, I hope my obituary doesn't read that a bunch of strong-armed women beat me to death with paddles. So what's Title IX to our viewers?
Title IX is federal law that requires equal educational opportunities for men and women, for male student athletes and female student athletes. And so that has become an equalization of the number of scholarships program-wide that women's athletics offers and men's athletics offers at any particular university. It has not really meant, though, that the universities spend the same amount of money on women's athletics as they do on men's athletics. I mean, I think virtually any major college program is still going to spend significantly, much, much more money on their men's athletic programming than they do on their women's athletic programming. But Title IX is intended to have equal opportunity for student athletes.
Now, what's the case at UNI that our viewers might remember affecting on Title IX?
Well,
is that the demise of their baseball team?
Yeah, for years and years, because football is such a gargantuan sport in terms of the number of scholarships it takes to field a competitive football team, that to equalize the number of scholarships, universities have faced the choice of either putting just a lot more money into women's athletics or taking money away from scholarships into men's athletics, or probably a little bit of both. But yeah, for decades, it's been a real challenge for, I think, what they're sometimes called the Olympic sports, men's Olympic sports. Look at the number of wrestling programs and how that's dwindled over the last 30 years, or baseball programs, like at UNI. That has been a trend that's been going on for at least a generation.
I think it's been a thing too that some administrations have used that as an excuse to cut a sport. Instead of saying, okay, we'll do this, we'll increase numbers over here, we'll say, oh, it's just easier to take away numbers over here, especially if you've got a program that, it's not generating a lot of money, maybe the interest isn't what it was. I just, wrote a comment last week about wrestling in particular, that if your program becomes irrelevant, you're putting yourself on the chopping block. That's why you've got to have relevant and exciting, and in that sport have programs that are on the move instead of sitting idle or falling back. UNI's wrestling program, I believe, was in that boat 4 or 5 years ago. Iowa State baseball, had the same fate, and wrestling programs have dwindled to very small numbers because of that, in the name of gender equity. Was not the intention of gender equity. Was not to take away opportunity from men. It was to give opportunity to women. But sometimes it just depends how a college looks at that. Fortunately, University of Iowa has been very proactive in increasing women's opportunities instead of taking away from the men's side for the most part.
And some of that depends on possibly regionalization. I think I went to school in California, and if you talk to a California college crowd or something about a bunch of really interested college players going to a hockey game, like at Minnesota and the northern climates, they wouldn't have an idea on what it was.
Well, that's what it saves those niche sports, the Olympic sports. The sports that are important to your school. I had mentioned earlier, that wrestling is big at certain schools. Baseball's big at certain schools, but it might not be big someplace else. Like you said, it's hockey team. Iowa has no hockey teams in the state. You and I, Iowa State or Iowa, do not have hockey teams. They've got club teams, but they don't have varsity level teams.
And they don't have anything like the East Coast and the Ivy League does on lacrosse. They follow lacrosse.
Yeah.
Cornell's getting lacrosse. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah. And you have to see, and that's up to those institutions. They have to make those decisions. What can they afford? What is a priority? What isn't a priority? It's like you talked about wrestling. Is wrestling a priority? If it is, then they have to put the funds into it. If they do that, then per gender equity, then they have to do something on the women's side, which is, but it's one thing if you look at, and JR, you would know, is if you go to any large institution, football takes up 85 scholarships. There's nothing on the women's side that offsets that. So what happens is if you go to the non-revenue sports, you go to a baseball and softball, there are many more scholarships given to the softball team versus the baseball team. And that's how they...
Or in track. There's
men's swimming, women's swimming, men's track, women's track.
Right, yeah.
But it's not necessarily clear that, this idea of whether Northwestern football team or any other college athletic program, whether they can or form a union, whether they have the right to, that doesn't necessarily impact Title IX. It potentially could, but there's no reason necessarily that those two things could not exist side by side.
But that goes back to a point I made earlier, was that's why a lot of proponents, a lot of people want football taken out of the equation. They want it to be a completely separate thing because of it is the 500-pound gorilla in the room, and people say, well, you can't count that because it's not, there's no equal sport on the women's side and that kind of thing, and then it goes back to some of the other issues they're having with football, as well as the time commitment and all that kind of stuff as well.
JR, do you think it's fair to say that the interest is trending up towards the kids ought to get something more than what they've got now?
I think one of the more recent surveys said they don't think kids should be getting paid even a stipend. That most of the people think that the scholarship is enough. And again, you go back to what we talked about earlier about the housing allowance and the food allotment and stuff like that. But they are asked to do an awful lot for the university.
Okay, I'm gonna have that be your final comment, JR. We got about a minute left. Nate, final couple words?
Yeah, I mean, really quickly, this case is probably going to be litigated for years in the federal courts. Federal labor law controls this question, but we just want to point out that if this were to happen at Iowa State University or University of Iowa, this would actually be controlled by state law, and these decisions would be made by an organization you've probably never heard of called the Public Employment Relations Board in Des Moines, with a slightly different law in Iowa that's different from the federal law and different standards. So stay tuned.
And a quick final word, John?
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting discussion, and I think there are a lot of people on both sides. And
okay. On behalf of the Interreligious Council, Cedar Rapids and Iowa City, thank you for joining us this morning, and go out and make our community a better place to live for us all. Sorry to